everybody, welcome. Welcome to part 2 of People of the Sun, Origins of Aztecs with Albert Coffey. Welcome. People are starting to come in. Before we get started, I just wanted to give you a quick rundown of some of the upcoming webinars that we have on our schedule. So next week on August 13th, we have Chef Les Carmona joining us same time, 5 p.m. For the Milpa Mesoamericana, the Holy Trinity and the Seven Warriors. This is a webinar about ancient foods and how they show up on the Mexican table in current times, and also how this can play into very good nutrition and perfect nutrition, as Les Carmona calls it. We also have on August 18th, we have Alberto Lenz will be returning with a webinar on Nahui Olin, who is a figure in change in the feminine realm in Mexico. Very interesting figure in the art world and in the feminist movement, although you'll see that whether it wasn't her intention or not is to be judged by you. And we also have August 25th, Bill Levasseur from the Mass Museum will be returning with a more focused webinar based on 8 dances. He'll be focusing on 8 masks and 8 dances and going more into depth about those things. So I hope that you will join us. And please tell us in the chat where you're coming from. And if you haven't donated yet, please make sure you do so on our website, www.languageadventurepros.com/webinars. We'll throw that in the chat. And welcome again. Thank you all for coming. And I'm going to turn this over to Albert Coffey.
Thank you very much. I appreciate being a part of this. As I've mentioned before, thank you, ladies. Looking beautiful as ever, and I really thank you for letting me do this. To get started here, I have a Netflix update. I'm on the 10th and final season of Modern Family. The themes are relatively repetitive, but a lot of laughs packed into a short amount of time, so I've enjoyed that. I'm trending towards comedies right now, for reasons I'm sure we probably all understand. I also have 2 very brief COVID-19 tips as they relate to antibacterial gel. 2 or 3 times now I've found myself where I've left a supermarket or another place, got into my car and forgotten to apply the gel, and find myself with my finger near or in my nose, and then out of panic I have inserted the gel directly into my nasal cavity. I do not recommend it. It's a very interesting sensation, to say the least. Another piece of advice, if you have recently, within the last few seconds, applied antibacterial gel to both of your hands fully, and then use a lighter to light something like a stove in the kitchen, not a good idea. Okay, now, the people of the sun. Oh, I am an archaeologist. I studied anthropology at Louisiana State University. My background is the archaeology of Mesoamerica. That's what my coursework was focused on. I worked in commercial archaeology for several years in the American Southeast mainly, doing archaeological surveys and excavations and what's called commercial archaeology as a field technician, and moved to Mexico about 17 years ago and was invited by Gabriela Cepeda, the lead archaeologist, to participate for a short time in the excavation of Cañada de la Virgen, the archaeological site outside of San Miguel. And I was also contracted by the owner of that hacienda upon which the site is located to compile a documentation of the legends, wisdom, and memories of the elders of the ranch communities on and around the archaeological site. Great opportunity. I'm going to share. I've already shared a little bit of what I've heard from some of the elderly people when I did that study, and I'm going to include a link to that a little bit later in the webinar, sort of a breakthrough I've come across recently. But the People of the Sun is a series. This is the first installment, the 2-session webinar. origins of the Aztecs. And my main focus for this is to focus on the mythology, geography, and ethnic origins of what we know today as the Aztecs, who occupied just the last 200 years, were in power over central Mexico between 1325 and 1521 AD, the very last 200 years before the Spanish arrived. And Cortez started his murderous and bloody conquest, aided by other indigenous people who had resented the Aztecs for constant subjugation, raiding of their villages for sacrificial victims during what we call the Flowery War, and extracting tribute from them on a steady basis. So let's go ahead and get started. If I had to go back in time, okay, we've got the same problem happening again. I can't make my, there we go. Okay, got it. Okay, if I had to go back in time to one moment in history, if I could time travel, I think that moment in history that I would choose to witness would be the contact period, the time when the Europeans first made contact in this hemisphere, North America and South America. To the time when Cortez and his men, and well, I call it the largest case of culture shock in human history. I would have loved to have witnessed it. And to keep some continuity, I'm going to start this one off like I did last time. And I'm going to start with a quote by Bernal Diaz, one of the conquistadors, one of the soldiers who went along with Cortez and his band of criminals as they entered into the central Mexico and came upon the great capital city of the Aztecs, Tenochtitlan, the place where the nopal cactus grows among the rocks. And here we've seen this painting you see in front of you several times, but as you can see, that's the island city in the middle of Lake Texcoco and the Great Valley of Mexico. Popocatépetl, Smoking Mountain, and Ixtaccíhuatl, Sleeping Woman, the two volcanoes on the eastern horizon. Now here's a quote. This quote comes from Bernal Diaz on November 8th, 1519, when Cortez and his men arrived into the very heart of the Aztec city, their actual heart of the Aztec universe, the central plaza and sacred precinct right here where the four cardinal points meet and the four causeways that reach the banks meet, everything laid out to four quadrants and the four cardinal directions, the center of the universe where the four winds and the four directions meet, the very sacred precinct of Tenochtitlan. And here's what he said. After seeing all of it clearly and contemplating all that we had seen, we beheld the great central plaza and the multitude of people who gathered there. Some were buying and some were selling, and the humming and the rumbling of voices made it seem as if more than one language was being spoken. Among us, there were soldiers who had traveled to many parts of the world. They had been to Constantinople, throughout all of Italy, and even to Rome. And they said that they had never seen or beheld a plaza so finely laid out, so rigidly aligned, and so large and full of people. That's a first impression. Of course, the process of subjugation, destruction, and elimination of Mesoamerican and Mexican culture, language, architecture, and identity was started at that point. But in the southern part of the city, in these areas you see here where I have my little laser pointer pointing, this is what we call the Chinampa area of the city. Now I mentioned that Chinampas, raised field types of agriculture, which originated really back in the classic period of the Mayan area and the lowlands of the classic period Maya, between really as early as right before the turn of the millennium and up through about 900 AD in the lowlands of Tabasco, central Yucatan, parts of Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras, and western El Salvador, the classic period Mayan lowlands, this type of agriculture, there's still evidence for it. And that process of agriculture, intense hand cultivation, was practiced upon these plots, rectangular plots made up of lake vegetation, large mats of lake vegetation that floated upon which mud from the bottom of the lake was packed tightly and anchored by cane or willows planted around the edges. Among the food crops, I had this question come up me recently. Among the food crops that were originated in Mesoamerica and that the Aztecs further cultivated there towards the end, and still today, corn, beans, squash, tomato, potato, sweet potato, manioc, papaya, avocado, amaranth, chia, chili peppers, chicle for making chewing gum, peanuts, cashews, jicama, guava, chocolate and vanilla, rubber, tobacco, cotton. My very favorite, the nopal cactus, of course, important in the symbolism and the Mexican flag and where the eagle landed, the signal to build their city. The agave cactus, my favorite, for reasons that we probably all know. Forgive me for any repetition here if people have heard this already. Tobacco, and many others. That's an abbreviated list. But if you can imagine Italy without tomatoes, Ireland without potatoes, and the whole world without chewing gum, tobacco, chocolate, and vanilla, it'll give you an idea just how important Mesoamerica and Mexico in general was to the production of certain foods that are now shared throughout the world. Other plants that were cultivated included medicinal plants, vast array of medicinal plants, the knowledge of the use of which has been gradually lost over time as younger people throughout history have failed to learn from the elders, and this information has not been passed down like it was before. Some of that information I learned about the plants as I go and as I talk to people out in the country, rural areas of Cañada de la Virgen. There's also included psychotropic plants or hallucinogenic plants. The hallucinogenic mushroom, peyote, San Pedro cactus, different native flowers and seeds that were hallucinogenic. Some were so powerful that they could not be ingested directly. And for example, animals who ingested them and processed them, their urine was consumed to dilute it, otherwise it was fatal. But these were consumed in large quantities by the elite priests during ceremony to allow them to achieve a level of consciousness which made it possible for them, and their main objective during ceremony, to communicate with the ancestors. Ancestral veneration is a brief way of describing the religion of the ancient Mesoamerican people. Copal incense, the dried resin from the copalillo tree was copal incense, an important ritual function. Smoke from the incense rose as what we call the vision serpent. The psychotropic plants, yoga-type posturing, bloodletting, these different methods of achieving ecstatic state by priests and shamans allowed them to witness the smoke rising from the copal in the form of a serpent, its mouth opening, and the human head emerging from the mouth of the snake. And that was the ancestor with whom they communicated. Now, I can get back into that a little bit later, but the city itself, at the time of the Spanish conquest, was made up of these Chinampa areas here in the south, what we call today Xochimilco, intersected by canals that allowed canoe traffic, and the central area inside of the Cuatlepantli, which is the snake wall, the sacred precinct. But those Chinampas and that intensive style of agriculture is what gave the Mexica, otherwise known as the Aztecs, a leg up on all the other people who surrounded them on the banks of the lake. They were able to produce, through intense hand cultivation, certain crops throughout the year rather than seasonally, and that allowed them to support a very large population, estimated to be at about between 150 and 200,000 people. Definitely the largest city in all of Mesoamerica and perhaps this hemisphere at the time of the European arrival. And it's estimated that maybe 60,000 or more habitational structures existed, and at least 78 ceremonial structures inside of the sacred precinct. Of course, the double temple dedicated to Tlaloc, the rain god, Huitzilopochtli, the Aztec patron god of war and sacrifice, associated with the sun and the eagle. Quetzalcoatl, god of light, life, artistry, the wind, and knowledge, and his aspect. Ehecatl, the god of windstorms and the wind. temple dedicated to Tezcatlipoca, the god of deceit, sorcery, darkness, death, and the underworld, and many more. Part of this webinar today, the second half, is going to be dedicated to a brief introduction to the deities and the god or gods that the Aztec worshipped and to who they owed in their belief system the blood of sacrificial victims as appeasement. It's a vast array, hundreds if not thousands of deities, different deities with many different aspects, overlapping each other, some serving equal functions, some all related to the natural forces, foods, different groups of people, artisans, scribes, traders, priests, the celestial bodies, the sun, moon, and Venus being the most important three. I will be getting into that in more detail as a brief introduction to the deities shortly. But in the centuries leading up to the Spanish invasion, and we have to keep in mind this, that when we talk about the Mexica, and I'll use the general term Aztec, the Mexica, the name given to the Aztecs at Chicomostoc, as they left Aztlan, the place of white herons, their mythical homeland, and when they stopped at Chicomostoc, the hill of seven caves, the place of seven caves, Mount Culhuacan, Huitzilopochtli, the patron deity, was probably actually a deified hero or leader, and his deity form gave them the name Mexica. We refer to them as Aztecs, which refers to the name Aztlan and is the name of their ancient homeland, which is referred to as the place of white herons. But that is the time period between 1111 AD, when they started their migration, to 1521, the time of the Spanish conquest. And in the centuries leading up to that Spanish conquest, this powerful society was dominated a large portion of what is now Mexico, central area mainly, with excursions out into the Oaxacan area and as far as Central America, but their main area of domination was central Mexico. They were known by their familiar name Aztec and characterized as much by their warlike nature as by the numerous military and commercial outposts that they had placed in the areas they had come to dominate. The Mexica had converted themselves into the possessors, the inheritors, and the continuers of the cultures that had developed in the regions that they conquered, the ones that they controlled. Their complicated rituals, the times for which were dictated by a very elaborate and complex calendar system, their socio-political organization, the necessity for luxury goods for the elite ruling class, all of this led them to establish complex systems of tribute that ensured the continuity of their empire. I have referred to these people as the people of the sun. But there's another group of migrants I referred to at the beginning of the webinar among the Aztecs, the Chichimecs, the Tepanecs, the Acolhua, that are perhaps the first to have actually entered the Great Valley of Mexico, a people who paid homage to the moon, the patron deity related to the moon, and who spoke a language far different than the Nahuatl speakers that I just mentioned. Nahuatl being the most widely spoken indigenous language in Mexico, and the language spoken by those people who became the Aztecs, the majority of them. They had participated, these people, in the construction of the great metropolis and unifying force, Teotihuacan, which ruled over all of Mesoamerica during what we call the Classic period. They had settled in other places later, like the Toltec capital of Tula, and helped to build that capital. Their semi-nomadic nature allowed them to maintain distinct customs and traditions and to ally themselves with many different groups who had claimed descendancy from the noble keepers of wisdom, the seers, the mystic and powerful Toltecs, from which all people who dominated the Valley of Mexico had claimed to have descended from. These people were the Otomi. Okay, now the Otomi I call the forgotten people, the people of the moon. Before I start talking about the people of the moon, though, I have a side note, and I'll get right back to this, but I forgot, there's something I wanted to mention because it came to me recently. I talked about the sunstone, and I talked about the Aztec vision of time broken into different eras that were imperfect, 4 different eras or ages that they called suns. Each were imperfect and ended in calamity. Basically, imperfect eras in which the gods were trying to perfect their creation of the present day world or sun, the fifth era that we live in today, and humanity in general. 4 ages, 4 jaguar here. Well, first, you can see around the edges of the sunstone this piece of art that incorporates calendrical elements, the fire serpent meeting with the head here, and the open snake's mouth, the human head emerging here from the snake's serpent's mouth, and meeting here at the top with the 2 tails touching at 13 read, the date glyph for the creation of this present sun. This is actually a reference to that ancestral veneration I mentioned, and the vision serpent and ancestral veneration or ancestor worship. But these 4 ages and everything laid out to the 4 cardinal directions, 4 jaguar, 4 wind, 4 rain, water, and 4 rain. 4 jaguar in that era, they believed that giants roamed the earth and harvested natural foods like berries and fruits and seeds and nuts, and were eventually consumed by jaguars. The interesting thing about that is that when I was interviewing some of the people out in these rural areas around Cañada de la Virgen, the cowboys and farmers and their families that live out there, many of whom are probably descended directly from the pyramid builders, many times I would come across people who actually did believe that there was a race of giants who came before us, before present-day humans, and could not convince them otherwise. And they believe that skeletons have been found. There's a little presita on the road that goes out to the archaeological site on one of the ejidos, the communal ranches, and it's basically a presita is a small dam that's made of dug up earth around a creek that traps rainwater so that the animals can drink from it. And they named it Presita del Gigante, or the little dam of the giant. I asked them why it was named that, and they said because they had maybe 50 or 100 years ago, someone digging up the Presita had discovered huge giant bones, like leg or arm bones of a giant. And they said that the person who owned them had them kept in a house and were on display for a while. They didn't know what happened to them. And I told him that a more feasible explanation for that is that it could have been a mammoth or a mastodon, because those megafauna, the remains of those megafauna had been discovered a bit south of the San Miguel area. So maybe that was a mistake on their part. But anyway, we are now, this era, 4 jaguar ended with the jaguar consuming the giants. 4 wind, the hard winds blew away the humans, converting them into birds. And this 4 water, a deluge, a flood, flooded out the humans and converted them into fish. And in the 4th era, 4 rain, a rain of fire, burned them all away. And I talked about other creation stories leading up to the creation of humanity. In our present age, represented by this H symbol, which means Oyin or movement, Tonatiuh, the sun god here in the center, is named movement because in this 5th era, it is predicted to end in earthquakes. And that's just a review from last time. And back to the Otomi. I'll call the Otomi the forgotten people, maybe better phrased as the overlooked people. The Otomi people they were probably the first to enter the Valley of Mexico when those waves of migration happened around the 12th century AD. And they settled in the southern part of the valley in those areas of Chinampa agriculture near the southern part and in Lake Chalco. Chaltocan was their main area of settlement in the southern end of the valley. At one point, the Tepanecs I mentioned had pushed them out. Some believe that the Otomi people, though, even though they've been neglected by historians, ethnographers, and historians and anthropologists throughout history, were a very integral part in the building and the development of Mesoamerican culture and the various sites that make it such an important culture hearth in the world. Some believe that the Otomi are actually the people who occupied Teotihuacan. But the continuity of art and architecture and cultural elements between Teotihuacan, Toltec, Tula, and the Tenochtitlan and the Aztec Empire lead us to believe that it was probably the Nahuatl-speaking people who actually built, but Otomi had a part in the construction of that great metropolis, that great unifying force for Mesoamerica. They also helped to build Toltec Tula pottery from the archaeological site of Cañada de la Virgen, and if these were, as the theory is that related to the Otomi's ancestors. Their type of pottery was discovered later at places like Toltec Tula, where they became closely allied to the Toltecs, which of course was extremely important to them. They eventually became at least elite mercenary marksmen or bowmen for the Aztec army. The name Otomi can be literally translated as bird shooters, said to be able to shoot birds out of the sky with a bow and arrow, known for their marksmanship. And they have been neglected throughout history and a negative light cast upon them because they were considered traitors in the end, because they're one of the groups like the Tlaxcalans who in the end joined up with the Spanish to help overthrow them during the Spanish conquest out of revenge, as I mentioned, for those sacrificial victims taken in their subjugation. Most famous now in these days for their embroidery and their textiles and their art. Mostly naturalistic figures, animals, and nature. This is a piece of art. It probably comes from the Puebla area. And I know that you ladies had mentioned Bill Levasseur and his wife Heidi, who own Casa de la Cuesta and the Mask Museum. Well, Heidi is an expert in Otomi art and has connections to the people of Puebla. And if you ever do visit their museum, definitely do that. I highly recommend it as a must-do activity here in San Miguel. Not only the Mask Museum and Bill's expert knowledge on Mesoamerica and the traditional mask usage throughout Mexico, but Heidi is an expert in the art, and she gives a great presentation about Otomi art, and that is not to be missed. Now, another person who I've mentioned earlier, one of the chroniclers of New Spain, was a Franciscan friar. His name was Fray Bernardino de Sahagún, and he is one of the foremost authorities on everything Mexican or Mesoamerican as an eyewitness during the early colonial period in the late 1500s, and he talked about the Otomi. Now, his book is called The General History of the Things of New Spain. And what he said about the Otomi was this: the word Otomitl, which is Nahuatl, comes from Oton, the name of one of their deified or hero leaders. Other historians, as a side note, say that the word Otomitl actually comes from the name of one of the sons of the progenitor deities of the land of the seven caves at Chichimostoc. But they themselves, Sahagún mentions, were called Otomites among themselves. They called themselves Otomites and had their own social organization and their own republic. He remarked on the quality and beauty of their finely woven clothing made of cotton and their polished footwear. Sahagún also states they lived in a hierarchical society with different classes of leaders and underlings, and among them a class of priests. Among these people were a class of priests who were considered seers of the future and connected themselves to the gods, and the gods spoke through them to the people. Among these priests, there was one supreme leader, but the priests were asked by the people at times when it was appropriate to go to war, the success they would have during a military campaign, whether or not a year would bring about rain or drought, disease or famine, and these priests were treated as gods themselves when their predictions came true. Now, Sahagún also spoke of a way in which the young were raised and indoctrinated, and a form of penitence was included, including nights without sleep, long periods of fasting, times of sacrifice, when maguey cactus spines were used to pierce their lips and limbs. The heads of young boys and men were shaved in a particular fashion, and the way that they wore their hair indicated a particular status of the individual. He talks about the lips and ears that were pierced and inlaid with ornaments made of various materials, including shell, obsidian, clay, gold, copper, among others, and that again, each different material related to that person's social status. Women practiced a form of body painting and scarification as a rite of passage. Sahagún also referred to the food that they prepared being mostly based on the plants that they cultivated, being corn, beans, tomatoes, very delicious tamales made with various proteins, including rabbit and deer, and even a type of small dog that they consumed. He also pointed out that the Otomi were quite adept at the production of pulque, the fermented heart of the maguey cactus, from which that inebriating beverage, actually very nutritious contains B vitamins, iron, and calcium, things that corn does not, and was actually consumed during times of drought. And it's but mainly by the priest during special occasions and during ceremony. That's Tagun. I'll be talking about him as well further along. But the language itself, now, I mentioned the Otomi language, much different from Nahuatl. Of the 68 languages spoken in Mexico today, it's the 7th most widely spoken. And there are 4 different dialects or versions of it spoken. Now, I'm going to try, bear with me today, and I'm going to try my best to pronounce some of these words written in different alphabets and some of these Nahuatl names for the gods and other things that are hard for me to pronounce. Bear with me. It's even hard for even the linguist to pronounce on many occasions, but Nyanyu is the language spoken in this part of Mexico. The Otomi variety spoken in the western part of the Otomi realm, which is the central plateau or central mesa called the Altiplano Central of Mexico. Nyanyu is spoken in Valle de Mezquital and Hidalgo here in Guanajuato State and eastern parts of Michoacan. Nyuhu is spoken in the Sierra Madre, the eastern Sierra Madre, mainly in the areas of northern Puebla. Ñato is spoken in the area around Toluca, which is near Mexico City. And Nyumu is spoken in southern Querétaro. And the Otomi people, by the way, may have been the people who first founded the ancient original settlement that we now call Querétaro, the city, about an hour here away from San Miguel. So those are the 4 dialects spoken in this area. One interesting thing about anthropology, and as I mentioned before, it's broken into cultural anthropology, physical anthropology, archaeology, the study of the material remains of cultures, and linguistics. And one amazing thing that linguists are able to do is use this method that they call glottochronology, in which they can determine at certain points throughout history when certain languages broke away from each other, from a native tongue, from a mother tongue, they call it. Now, Otomi is part of a language family that we call Otomangue. That language family, a branch of that is Otopame. Their language is very similar to the languages that are spoken in the Otopame group and part of the larger family Otomangue, spoken as far south as Oaxaca, including Zapotec, Mixtec languages, and even one spoken as far away as El Salvador. The map of Mexican languages is like a mosaic, people moving around, separating, and the languages you can see related to Otomi stem from a mother tongue. It goes back to as early as around 5000 BC up until about 2100 BC, where it branched off into 2 different trajectories. Eventually, around 500 AD, branching off yet again, and further near the Spanish conquest, branching off into Chichimec, forms of Pame, Mazahua, Matatzlinca, Oquilteco, and Otomi, in those 4 different branches I mentioned. It is a tonal language. By tonal, I mean it is like Southeast Asian and Chinese languages where the tone of your voice as you pronounce a certain word changes its meaning. The presence of tonal languages throughout Mexico, art, iconography, religious elements, pottery styles, link these people in Mexico to places in Southeast Asia and China. Evidence for an actual arrival by Chinese or Southeast Asian peoples to Mexico before the Spanish conquest has not been fleshed out by archaeological research, but there are some unique connections that make us categorize Mesoamerican people more as an Oriental group, as in their religion and view of the world and cosmos, rather than Western. But I have to mention at this point also that ethnicity and culture can be defined in different ways. Now, ethnicity and culture can be defined by the language that you speak. It can also be defined in other ways through socio-economical situations, through shared lifeways, ideology, biologically, And we consider the Otomi a very unique group in that they were often marginalized by others and neglected by historians and ethnographers and left out of the general, not given the credit due that was given to Nahuatl speakers for the creation and the development of the advanced civilization that we call Mesoamerica, and in particular, the Aztec Empire. As far as the archaeological record goes and geography, a place called Jilotepec, and that is near Tula and the state of Mexico, is depicted by the place name here in one of the codices produced during the 1500s. Any place name in these codices is depicted by the symbol for a mountain, and then a symbol above, like these two corn cobs emerging, or a symbol below. In this case, Jilotepec refers to these new ears of corn rising from the mountain. Jilotepec geographically is located right here near Tula, the Toltec capital, a place called Huichapan, which is where one of the codices were written. And another western site of the Otomi is here in Pátzcuaro, Michoacán. Now, DNA analysis and recent studies done from skeletons discovered at Cañada de la Virgen, which is here in the El Bajío region. And by the way, this line that you see here was in 2005 were the limits of northern limits of Mesoamerica. They've had to readjust that, include this area up here around Guanajuato State and El Bajío based on recent archaeological research. But DNA analysis has linked the people buried there to people in the Pátzcuaro region of Michoacán, the areas in Jalisco where there were mostly Nahuatl speakers, and even as far away as Yucatec Mayan. But you have to keep in mind that all these people ethnically and genetically overlapped each other, and the Otomi were mixed in to all these areas in the Central Plateau, mostly living in higher altitudes and mountainous areas, and combined the form of hunting and gathering with agriculture, and were never actually as much a part of the rigid social structure that came about during the Aztec conquest. Today, the 20th century, these are the main areas of Otomi occupation. The central area, what they call the riñón, or the kidney of the Otomi realm. They say kidney, meaning the central area of a territory, here in Jilotepec and around Tula and the Valle de Mezquital of Hidalgo, southern Querétaro, parts of Mexico State, and northern and eastern Hidalgo, Veracruz, and what we call the Sierra Madre Oriental, or the Eastern Sierra Madre. And then here, a little offshoot here in Guanajuato, right here, exactly where we are in San Miguel. One of the only remaining or existing codices that we know came from the Otomi, produced during this one, I believe, the late 1600s, is called the Codex Huichapan. And as was the case with other codices that come from different areas of Mesoamerica, they documented astronomical information, historical, dynastic information, stories of conquest, and cultural traits and burial practices. And here on this page of 3, you can see that this little block depicts an eclipse. It's a date glyph, 3 reed. And any date glyph placed against a backdrop or a black background means that on that day, there occurred an eclipse. And predicting eclipses to Mesoamerican people, in particular the Otomi, and predicting lunar eclipses was extremely important. Here we have an image that depicts the Otomi conquering a neighboring or rival city. And here, the most interesting one to me is a depiction of a burial practice that we call the sacred bundle. This is a burial practice in which an elite person was wrapped into a bundle made of plant fiber and placed with many different offerings, including pottery, sacrificial knives, bloodletting instruments, incense burners, jewelry, things that person would have taken along with them into their underworld or into their afterlife to continue. And many times dogs were sacrificed and sent with these people, believed to have been sent by the gods to accompany them, well, humans, infants as well, and aborted fetuses, believed to be the gods incarnated, sent to accompany the recently deceased elite into the underworld. And this burial practice is played out in the archaeological record of Cañada de la Virgen, where burial number 13, El Jerarca, the hierarch, was buried in the floor of the temple, wrapped in the sacred bundle, but he had been dead already for over 1,000 years. That's one of the most interesting burial practices I can think of in this part of the world. The patron deity of the Otomi was Mixcoatl, cloud serpent, represented in the night sky, manifested as the Milky Way galaxy, also known as the traveler of the southern sky. And he's depicted here always with black around the eyes because he was the patron god of hunters. And in the desertish areas where the Otomi lived, in the high plains of central Mexico, black was painted around the eyes as a way of eliminating the glare that came up from the desert floor and from the sun as they hunted. He's also possibly, as we mentioned before, a mixture of myth and reality, as he was probably an actual physical human leader who led the Otomi people on their migration south from the northwestern areas or northern central Mexico into the Valley of Mexico around the 12th century AD. So he was a deified hero as well. And this is where we get to the most important part of the webinar to me. Now, I mentioned the story about the eagle, the snake, and the cactus, and how Huitzilopochtli had come to the priest as they battled on the fringes of Lake Texcoco, and the priest had had the vision of the eagle with the snake in its beak landing on the cactus. Of course, the snake in the beak came later with colonial chroniclers, but we'll go with that for now. This is an Otomi textile you see showing the eagle, snake, and cactus, the eagle lands. Well, the story that I told you that Don Gabino told me in Toriles, where I interviewed the old man who told me about the eagle who was going to land on the nopal cactus on his Quesillo, the ruins of the pyramid, and that place was to be Mexico, Tenochtitlan, where the eagle landed, and that the boy had thrown the rock and scared the eagle away, and he'd flown down to the Valley of Mexico to land on that big island in the lake. The other man who told me that the eagle had not landed on his Quesillo because there was not enough water, and he knew that one day his great city would need much more water, so he flew down to the big lake. And then the third man who said that the eagle had not landed on his Quesillo because the eagle could see into the future and knew that he would need a much wider space for his trains and cars and airplanes and his great city to be. Well, I came across something that helped validate the legitimacy of that story that links it to actual Otomi legend. I came across an Arqueología Mexicana magazine, in which, if I can try to pronounce this guy's name for you, in the back of the magazine, this was a doctoral thesis that was written in 1999 by a man named, his name is Marcelo Augusto Abramo. And the name of his study, his doctoral thesis is El Principio. Now, I'm going to be translating this from Spanish, by the way, what I tell you next. But the name of his study is El Principio, El Fin, y El Medio, or the beginning, the end, and the middle. La ritualidad entre los otomíes del sur de Querétaro, which means the ritual life among the Otomís of southern Querétaro. Now, he, in his presentation in this magazine, has 3 different myths he talks about that he heard from the people who were Otomi speakers living in southern Querétaro. The first one was about the creation of the world, the present-day world. And the story goes, I'm translating this from Spanish, that God, their God, and his mother were running away from the demons of the underworld. And this is a reference, but he had not been born yet. Their God had not been born. Now this relates to Huitzilopochtli. Inside of his mother's womb, Cautlicu had been impregnated by the ball of feathers and then sprung forth to defeat the 400 offspring, and her body parts had fallen to the bottom of Coatepec, the Serpent Mountain, and that monument that they discovered in Mexico City to help them discover the Templo Mayor, the main temple. Well, and the progenitor or creator deities who are actually mother, father, who created all the other deities. There's a reference to that. But anyway, it says that God was inside the womb of his mother, and they were running from the demons. And God could speak to his mother from the womb. He said, "Mother, pick up some of these pebbles from the side of the path and throw them over your shoulder." And she did so. She obeyed him, and she threw the pebbles over her shoulder. Those pebbles converted themselves and grew into great mountains and hills and created a big mountain range that separated God and his mother from the demons. But then the demons eventually made it over the mountains and got closer and closer and started to approach them again. At this moment, God told his mother, grab that piece of broken mirror on the side of the trail, which is probably a reference to obsidian or pyrite, and throw it over your shoulder. She grabbed the piece of broken mirror and threw it over her shoulder, and that broken mirror became the lakes, the rivers, and the sea, and again blocked them from the demons. Eventually, with time, the demons made it over the ocean and over the rivers and over the lakes and came to approach them again and got closer and closer. So God, from the womb of his mother, said, Mother, grab some of those plants those men over there are planting and throw them over your shoulder. So she grabbed some of the plants and she threw them over her shoulder, and they became the forests and the rainforest and the jungle and separated them yet again from the demons. And ever since then, anytime the demons got closer, God and his mother created another something else to put between themselves and the demon. From that time on, my people have lived here in the mountains. Okay, that's one myth. The second one talks about the production of pulque and the origins of the production of pulque. This one is relatively simple and brief. It talks about how people did not yet understand that inside the heart of the maguey cactus was agua miel, honey water, that eventually becomes the fermented variety pulque. And that they noticed a hole had been drilled into the heart of the maguey cactus. And that is how they started to drink agua miel, honey water. But they couldn't figure out how or who had drilled this well-polished hole into the heart of the cactus to get to the water. And then they saw a field mouse, a rat, a maguey rat, running across the field and into the hole, and realized that it was a rat who had done it. And so from then on, they've always given credit to the rat for the production of pulque. But the most interesting myth that he talks about, and the one that links the story I heard from Don Gavino directly to Otomi legend, is this one. And it's about the foundation of people, of the creation of people, or their settlement of people. And it talks about the eagle. And he says that the people told him that the large giant eagle, he said that the people always settled where the eagle landed. Wherever the eagle landed, they would build a monument to welcome him and to honor him, upon which later were built Catholic churches. And that the eagle was to land in this valley where now you can witness the temple dedicated to San Ildefonso, a church. But in this great valley is where they planted their crops and where the eagle came to land. But the eagle was so big and giant, his wingspan was so wide that he couldn't fully expand his wings in order to take off and fly, and his wings brushed the mountains on each side of the valley. So it was not quite suitable for him. So he flapped his wings, he took off, and he flew down to the Valley of Mexico. And the people, because he had landed there, built their temple and built their church and came to settle in that valley. But then after that, the eagle flew down to the big swamp in the Valley of Mexico, and that's where the Aztecs saw him coming and decided that was to be their great city in the swampy lands around Lake Texcoco. Now that is a direct link to the story I heard from Don Gavino that up until this point, a few days ago, I thought was just a story that he could have made up. Of course, probably not, because the other men had talked about it, but gave great legitimacy to the fact that these elderly people are passing down stories that could have gone back to as far as the 12th century. Okay, that's something personally to me that gives me great pride that I was able to become a part of that and participate in the retrieval of that story. And others I'll be mentioning in future webinars. And that, to me, is the importance of the Otomi. Now, the Mexica, the Aztecs, are extremely warlike people. Each Tlatoani or ruler you can see in this list with different, very interesting names and different periods of reign leading up to the conquest. The most interesting name of which is this one down here, Cuitlahuac, which was the only ruled for a very short time after Montezuma was killed at the Spanish arrival. He died of disease brought by the Spanish, but divine excrement, that's my favorite. But they were warlike people. Their society and their ritual calendar revolved around human sacrifice. Each king or ruler or Tlatoani built upon his predecessors' exploits and expanded the domain based on the domains that had been passed down by the predecessors. each of these people, these Tlatoani, they were given power through heredity, sometimes brothers more than sons, and a panel of elders met to elect which family member was capable of rulership, of actually a form of democracy, which was very uncommon throughout Mesoamerica, where most leadership or rule was passed down father to son. But they passed these domains that they had conquered down to the upcoming Tlatoani, and in successive ways, they were able to expand their empire. As you can see, each one expanded more and more until we get to Montezuma, who expanded down into the Oaxacan area. And the warriors themselves were trained and fierce, and there were certain orders of warriors: the eagle warrior, the jaguar warrior, but the most elite of all. And your prowess as a warrior was based on how many sacrificial victims you had seized and how many deeds of heroism you had achieved during combat. But the most proud and elite warriors were the Otomi warriors. You can see one here dressed as a coyote warrior with his bow and arrow and known for their marksmanship, elite mercenary warriors for the Aztecs. The main purpose of warfare was not just to acquire territory and expand the domain and realm of the Aztecs, but it was also to acquire sacrificial victims during this ongoing flowery war, we call it, in order to bring back to their sacred heart of Tenochtitlan to sacrifice to appease their deities. Now, who were these deities? Well, I can only give you a very brief introduction. And the reason is there are so many deities with different aspects, hundreds if not thousands that haven't even been documented. I can only give you a brief introduction. So that's how I'm going to end this webinar. I'm going to give you a brief introduction into some of the most important deities worshipped and appeased by the Aztecs. And they're broken into 10 different categories. These categories you can see listed here. First, primordial creators, Ometeotl. Teo means holy or godlike. Ome, a reference to duality. This is a primordial creator deity that had feminine and masculine aspects and was basically the creator of all other deities. Ometecutli was the male version, and Omecihuatl was the female. Cihuatl means woman. Here you can see both of them depicted as they raise life from death, sacrifice, destruction, and death as necessary for life to emerge and creation to occur. Fate and destiny, and Tezcatlipoca. Tezcatlipoca, the god of deceit, sorcery, darkness. He was a deity that was related to rulership, an omnipotent deity associated with fate, both beneficial and destructive. He has other names like maker of himself, we his slaves, enemy, lord of the night, lord of the near and nigh, night wind, and he figures prominently in the coronation speeches and prayer among Aztec rulers. Depicted here, smoking mirror or obsidian mirror, this obsidian mirror on his foot and smoke emanating, and related to adivination and foreseeing the future. Sky deities include Tonatiuh, an aspect of the sun god or the sun himself. Netzli, goddess of the moon. Now bear with me on this one. I am not a linguist, so I'm trying my best here. Tlahuizcalpantecutli, or the Venus, the rising star, morning star. These images that you see are the deity versions of the celestial bodies. Mixcoatl, we mentioned the Milky Way and the patron deity and guiding force to the south of the Otomi people. Wind deities, Quetzalcoatl, the god of light, life, artistry, the wind, his aspect, Ehecatl, god of the wind, and designating him this caracol or snail shell symbol that you'll see him wearing in the art, which represents the whirlwind for wind, spiral. Fire deities, Huehueteotl, is actually a personification of the Xitle volcano, which erupted right before the founding of Teotihuacan, and he is a personification of that volcano, this urn that burned incense on his head being the crater. And of course, here you see that equilateral cross, which is the pre-Hispanic cross, goes back to the quadripartite vision of the universe and of Earth that is repeated throughout Mesoamerican history. Other fire deities, one related to the hearth, which is Chantico, you see here. And by the way, those pendants you see here are a symbol of rulership, associated with rulers, as the rulers were often believed to be these gods incarnated. Xutlekutli, another fire deity, very similar to Huehueteotl. Earth deities include Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl, the mountains themselves, the legend of the princess and the prince who became Sleeping Woman and Smoking Mountain. I relayed to you last time. There you go. There's Iztaccíhuatl looking like a sleeping woman. Mount Tlaloc, mountain in central Mexico near Mexico City, which is actually upon which was built a temple dedicated to the rain god Tlaloc. Tepeyotl is related to, he's actually considered the locus of Earth's regenerative powers. Huatlicu, these are female earth deities. Huatlicu, depicted here, with two serpents' faces meeting together to form a face, a composite face. These serpents representing the streams of blood that flow from a decapitated victim, which is one of the ways that they honored this deity. The hand-heart necklace close to the bosom as the giver of life, and also the taker, represented by the claws coming from the hands and feet, which scooped in the bodies of the dead that she consumed into the maw of the earth, the giver of life and the taker of life. Cihuacoatl, or serpent woman, another earth deity. Itzpapalotl, another earth deity. Now that one, Itzpapalotl, obsidian butterfly is her name. And Tlaltecutli, very similar to Huatlicu in that she is an earth deity crouched in the birthing position, the giver of life, and again the taker, claws for scooping in the bodies of the dead. Tlazolteotl means filth eater, again related to the consumption of the dead. The ones related to rain and water include Tlaloc, the rain god, usually depicted here with the snout emitting streams of fluid and the goggles of the warrior that go back to the elite people, and the artwork of Teotihuacan, the rain god. Multiple rain gods called Tlaloque, which were oriented towards each cardinal direction and quadrant of the universe. Now I'm going to try again on this one. Chalchiuhtlicue, she of the jade skirt, is the goddess of rivers, streams, and lakes. And you can see the jade-like skirt is actually the water that flows out from her womb. And this one, I'm not even going to try to pronounce for you. You can try. I'll go ahead and give it a shot. Iztlacoliki. Okay, like I said, I'm not a linguist, but this is the god called Obsidian Blade Curl, the deity of frost, snow, and the cold, and associated with snow-capped peaks. And just to give an idea of how each deity, they had deities for almost every aspect of life. Cihuatl is the goddess of salt. And one of my favorites, very interesting, Cihuateotl. Cihuateotl is the goddess of women who died in childbirth, considered the equivalent of warriors who had died in combat, who rose as deities. And some of these life-size statues of Cihuateotl are on display in the Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City. Maize and vegetation. Xilonin is the deity of the first tender maize. Centeotl is the goddess of late ripening maize. Her name is deified maize or divine maize ear. Chicomecoatl is seven serpent seed corn. Mayahuel is the goddess of the maguey cactus, closely related to the Oakley deities and the gods related to the production and consumption of Pulque. As you can see, this here taking place during ritual. Looks to me like this one had just a little bit too much, maybe. May have been a combination of that and peyote. And Xipetotec. Now this one gets a bit graphic, but one of my favorites as well. I've gone a little bit over time, but I'll wrap it up shortly. Xipetotec, our Lord the Flayed One, the god of the springtime, the god related to the time of year when the rain hits and the first flowers bloom. Here's a depiction in sculpture. Our Lord the Flayed One, because every year to honor him when the first rain hit, in order to honor him, the skin was flayed from a sacrificial victim and worn by a priest as he danced during the ceremony. Now, the flaying of the skin depicted a seed breaking, a new life emerging in the spring, and the skin itself represented the new layer of skin, like a new layer, like the new layer of green that covers the earth when the rain comes. Intimate, that is an intimate tie to Mother Nature and her processes. Xochipilli is the god of the summer and flowers and psychotropic plants. As you see peyote buttons here on the knees and other psychotropic plants depicted all over this sculpture. The summer being a rainy season when these plants bloom and blossom. Okay, and Xochiquetzal, she is a god that is a deity of flowers, plants, and song, dance, and games. Her name is Five Flower. I'm sorry, this is Flower Quetzal, goddess of flowers, grains, patroness of weavers. Maquil Xochitl is Five Flower, the deity of flowers, plants, song, dance, and games. And in the land of the dead, Mictlan is the land of the dead, the underworld. Mictlantecutli is the lord of the underworld. Mictlantecihuatl is his female counterpart. And deified heroes and ancestors. Now, Huitzilopochtli we've talked about, the patron god of the Aztecs associated with the sun and the eagle, and a deified hero, one of their leaders during their migration into the Valley of Mexico, to whom was dedicated part of the main temple at Tenochtitlan. We've mentioned Mixcoatl, the patron god of the Otomi and the Milky Way galaxy. Yaxquetecutli is the patron god of traders. The Pochteca were long-distance traders, had their own deity. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, again, a deity, but also a title for rulers, and in particular, the ruler of Toltec Tula, who was banished from the city after Tezcatlipoca, his arch rival, who was a human sacrificer, Quetzalcoatl against it, tricked into becoming drunk on Pulque, committing incest with his sister, and banned from the city, where he took his followers off to the Gulf of Mexico, made a raft of snakes, and set himself on fire, and rose as he traveled east as the rising star Venus. Now, I'm going to end it there. I could go much further into the detail about the deities in upcoming webinars. Please send your email through the chat, or we'll try to get in touch with you otherwise, or go to my website, because we would love to give information about upcoming webinars. I would love to do this again with the ladies here at the Language Pros, and also in the future do my own webinars where we'll focus on different aspects of Aztec and Mesoamerican culture, architecture, astronomy, the rulers, the religion, the food, medicinal plants, all different aspects in more detail with each upcoming webinar. So please stay in touch. And as I ended here with the feathered serpent, it may be appropriate to mention a tour I may have coming up at the end of September that I've done before, and you can see more detail and itinerary on my website, but the Trail of the Feathered Serpent, where we go first to Cholula, under the gaze of Popocatépetl Smoking Mountain, the largest pyramid in the world by volume. There is the Templo de los Remedios, the church built right on top of this hill, which is actually the Great Pyramid of Cholula, with kilometers worth of tunnels inside, an excavated archaeological part to visit. We also visit Cacaxtla and the unbelievably colorful and vivid painted murals of the Batun Maya, who made an excursion into central Mexico at Cacaxtla. And this is actually a battle between jaguar warriors of the Maya from the Batun area and some central Mexican eagle warriors, very graphic, very detailed. We go to Xochicalco. This is the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, one of the only Mayan influenced sites inside of central Mexico, and one of the most fascinating that I've ever been to. And Teotihuacan is a part of that trip. We also go to the different museums that display artwork at Teotihuacan. There is one of the rulers depicted as a feline, going back to that feline identity for the ruling class, consuming an ritual beverage. We go there. We go to the museum that was Cortes Palace in Cuernavaca. And we also go to Tepoztlan. Well, we go Chalcatzingo is an Olmec site where some of the early art of The Olmec is depicted like this one, where the seated figures inside the cave, the quatrepartite entrance to the cave, one of the only Olmec sites in central Mexico. But my favorite part of that trip is Tepoztlan, and that is an Aztec settlement. This town itself, built on an Aztec settlement, believed to be the legendary birthplace of the feathered serpent deity. A certain creative energy emits from the place, very mystic. A lot of psychic shaman type figures and healing practices occur there. People from Mexico City go on the weekends. It's a great place to be on a weekend, which is included in that trip. And we also have a chance to go to the top of this mountain where there's a temple dedicated to the god of Pulque. Very intense climb. The view is amazing though. The hotel we stay in, the town itself is enchanting. It's more like San Miguel probably was maybe 30, 40 years ago. Misty cloud cover over the town. The church itself has its own unique history going back to the early 1500s. The hotel is a boutique, great hotel, very comfortable, friendly people. There's the temple. There's a view from the mountain. And on that note, any questions?
Albert, we have a couple of questions in the chat box. One of them was, say something more about the practice of astronomy, specifically what instruments they use, presumably not telescopes?
Okay, yes. The field of archaeoastronomy is a relatively new field in anthropology and archaeology, and it is the study of the way that ancient people observed the sky and related their structures and calendar according to events that happened in the sky, and as those celestial bodies related to the landscape and to their ceremonial centers, and how they registered and kept track of time based on those events. The Venus cycle, the solar cycle, the cycle of the moon, all of these intertwine into really complex calendar systems, and the precision of their observations is unparalleled throughout the world. It is very common practice for ancient people to link themselves to the movements of these celestial bodies and to observe them completely on a long-term basis, thousands of years of observation in order to align their ritual and their calendar to keep the functioning of the cosmos in order and keep the crops coming. It's called reciprocal ceremony. But this was naked eye observation. They didn't have telescopes. They spent all of their lives from dawn to dusk, a priestly class of elite astronomers who spent their entire lives as they were pampered by the common people who were fed. They performed ceremony and they watched the sky nonstop, day and night, and marked where each time the sun set according and related to a part of the landscape, also considered deities, the hills and mountains, and they recorded it. And it was one of the most important jobs you could have in ancient Mesoamerica, and any slight mistake that was made, the resulting consequence was death in many cases. So they were rigidly tied to that and observing that. And it was all naked eye observation. There is a form of anthropology we call visual anthropology. And Dr. Rosana Quiros, who did over 10-year astronomical study at Cañada de la Virgen, conducted her study based on physical visual observation. Okay.
Thank you, Albert. In a related question about when you talk about the punishment for somebody getting the astronomical observations wrong, when you spoke about the sacrificial victim who was being flayed, was that considered an honor? How did they choose the person? Was it an honor or a punishment?
The generally accepted idea is that a sacrificial victim was believed at the time of sacrifice to skip the underworld and rise into the realm of the deities. So probably considered a great honor. Related to that original sacrifice by Nanahuatzin, the purulent one and the arrogant one who cast themselves into the bonfire at Teotihuacan to rise as the sun and moon, that original sacrifice related to the creation of humanity. So probably considered a great honor, not without fear, of course, but the vast majority of sacrificial victims in ancient Mesoamerica, and especially among the Aztecs, were male war captives. Male war captives acquired during their ritual combat, what we call the flowery wars, in order to appease their deities. Women and children were also sacrificed, more in relation to the coming of the rain. It said that the more the child cried at the time of sacrifice, the more rain would come. But the very origins of human sacrifice go back to the big game hunters who crossed over from Asia hunting megafauna like mammoth and mastodon and performed what we call infanticide. They killed infants because they couldn't have too many offspring to hold them back as they traveled great distances as they hunted these large animals and migrated from Asia. Anything else?
There's one more question we have, Albert, from, Sally Foltz wants to know, how are the names of the peoples subject to the Aztecs, the Mixteca, spelled? Mixteca?
Okay, are you talking about which people, do you have that written?
Sally posted it in the chat window. She says, how are the names of the people subject to the Aztecs spelled? Mixteca?
Okay, there were various different peoples. I think that what she's talking about are the Otomi, maybe? Okay. How are the names of the people subject? Mixteca. The Mixteca, that's right. She spelled it correctly. But you have to keep in mind that each of these different groups had their own alphabet and their own language. And the vast majority of them were translated into Nahuatl, which includes a lot of X's, a lot of TLs at the end. That was the lingua franca. So most of those were translated into Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, but each one of them had their own different alphabet and language. And that is for a linguist to really describe for you, because it takes a lifetime as a linguist to understand and learn a lot of these indigenous languages. Some of the languages, for example, will create a word from one root word and then add prefixes and suffixes until the word is up to 20 letters long, and it creates an entire sentence. So it depends on the region. But Mixtec is correct. Mixtec or Mixteca. That's the Oaxacan group. Okay. Any more questions?
Sally follows up and says, how do we spell these names today so she can read about them?
Okay. How about this? What I can do is, if she sends me an email, I can send her different links to different websites that can help her to delve into the different languages themselves. And I can also, by the way, if anyone would like to, send me an email and I can send a reading list. I give a class at the Instituto Allende 2 or 3 times a year on the pre-Hispanic history of San Miguel and the surrounding areas and the Maya. And at the end of those, at the beginning, I pass out a reading list to everyone. And if you would like that, I can easily send that to you. I'm not a linguist myself, so we use these Nahuatl ways of spelling that are basically an English variety, an English version of it. But please feel free to send me that email. One particular website that would be very useful for everyone if you're really into Mesoamerican information is FAMSI, F-A-M-S-I, Foundation for the Advancement of Mesoamerican Studies Institute. And that is a great website that covers basically all elements, linguistics, archaeology, and geography of Mesoamerica. That's included in the reading list.
Thank you.
www.famsi.org.
Great. We have one question from Mark. He says, did each word have a symbol?
Okay, now here is a big difference. Okay, now let's go back. None of these languages were written in the way that we write languages today, in an alphabet back then. For the Maya, or the only group in this hemisphere who had an actual writing system that could portray anything spoken. It was a combination of phonetic and semantic elements, and each word had pictures that created a sound and meaning, often a combination, or those two parts, a hieroglyphic system very similar to what the Egyptians used. In central Mexico and among the Aztecs, it was a very rudimentary, more pictographic type of writing. So the actual written language itself was yes, pictographic. It's just recently that linguists have started to translate and write these languages into a form that can be put into present day books. And each one of them has different alphabets with different symbols that create sounds that we don't have in the English language. Now, among the Otomi speakers, who live mostly centered in the Valle de Mezquital in the state of Hidalgo, they have books written in their language. The Zapotecs and Mixtecs of Oaxaca have their language written in books. They teach it to the kids and they promote it. Unfortunately, Otomi in particular, outside of that nuclear area around Jilotepec and Valle de Mezquital and Tula, outside of that area, and especially here in the areas around San Miguel, the language is being lost because the people, younger people are not learning it like they used to. Moving off to the cities, they've become ashamed of it. It's called a dialect. Government will send teachers out to these small communities to teach the children Otomi, and the parents will tell their children, don't waste your time, learn English. It's more useful. We don't use that language anymore. It's just not useful to us. And the very few elderly people in this area who do speak some of the language are mixing it with Spanish and using different versions of it, and they're losing it because they don't have anyone to practice it with. It's a sad situation. The further south you go in Mexico, the more intact the languages and the cultures, indigenous cultures, and more prideful they are. The central part of the country, as we know, colonized very early on by the Spanish, very thoroughly, and was very suppressed and stamped down throughout history, and still occurring.
Albert, I have a question. This is Ginger. Having lived in Asia for a little while and then living in Mexico, there's definitely some themes that I see that are very similar. Are there any active, is there active research going on about that, establishing that link, or trying to see if that link is proven?
So the link between what again? Tell me again.
The link between, to see if the genetic link for the native people in Mexico, linking that to Asia.
Oh, that's the problem. The problem with the genetics is that all indigenous people in this hemisphere, they're already Asian. They're mostly Mongolia area, Tibet area, Central Asia, and Northern. They all migrated from Asia at the end of the Ice Age, hunting megafauna like mammoth, and into the Ice Age, and entered this continent there 20, 30,000 years ago. So they're all genetically Asian anyway. So the DNA testing gets a little bit more complicated that way. So that is not necessarily the best way to link them. I personally believe that if there was ever any arrival by the Chinese or people from Asia before the Spanish conquest, it would have had to be very early on and very thorough in order for these different traits to be passed down into Mesoamerican civilization. But the fact that there are tonal languages and the art and whatnot so similar could be the fact that relate to the fact that they were all Asian to begin with. So DNA gets more complicated in that way. Again, I'm not a geneticist either, but there are ongoing genetic studies right now taking place that may help further flesh that out for us.
Thank you.
Yes.
I don't see any additional questions.
I see that one from Mark. He says, is the influx of foreigners helpful or damaging for the passing down the stories? Is that from Mark? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, I can address that. Actually, in my opinion, I think it's the opposite, because the influx of foreigners and tourists and whatnot who come to places like San Miguel help perpetuate these ceremonies and these parades and these cultural displays, not just foreigners, but people from other parts of Mexico. And the attention given by the very interested expat community and tourist community helps to perpetuate and further provide impetus for these people to preserve their culture and these stories. The real problem is the actual people themselves who have been separated from it because of this form of apathy or racism that comes from the early suppression by the Spanish and the Catholic Church. So in my opinion, I think the influx of foreigners actually helps to promote the further study and the further preservation of the history. And I, in particular, hope to participate in that further. And any more questions? Feel free.
Okay, I don't see any. Oh, here's one that's one that just came up from Mark. Okay, I don't see any more questions. So we'll wrap up unless somebody has a last minute question. Thank you, Albert. The series has been fantastic, and we really appreciate you being with us and talking to everybody about these such interesting topics. Thank you.
Well, it's been my pleasure. I could go on for a long time, and like I said, I've had some people comment about sometimes I move a little too fast or I try to pack too much in, so I'm learning as I go. This is only my 4th time giving one of these presentations through Zoom. So please stay in touch, and I want to continue this into the future with you guys and in general. So I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. And just to let everybody know, we do have a instructor that teaches Nahuatl. And so if you're interested in learning more about that native language, you can let us know. And also I'm going to put a link to our evaluation in the chat. And